I paid for that house. 6 years. Every dollar from my own work. But one day my brother, the person I trusted most, handed me a document saying it was just a formality. I signed. A month later, he threw me out of my own home. I thought that was the end, until I found my mother's voice on a hidden tape and learned the truth they'd buried my entire life. If you think this is just another family story, you're wrong. Don't forget to subscribe now to catch more of our shocking storytelling films. I was 9 when Mom died. People said grief was like a storm, but for me it was quieter than that. A long, slow winter that settled into the bones of our house. After the funeral, my father stopped speaking much. My brother Ethan, 2 years older, carried silence like a weapon. And me, I carried questions no one answered. We lived in the old house, you know the kind. Wraparound porch, heavy oak doors that groaned when you pushed them open. Walls that smelled like old pine after the rain. It sat tucked between fir trees like it didn't want to be seen. But I loved that house. My mother did too. I remember her hands most. Always working, fixing a loose hinge, painting the shutters, planting herbs along the kitchen window. When she wasn't working, she'd trace the lines of my face gently as if memorizing me for later. One night, weeks before she died, she sat with me under the staircase. We called it our hiding spot, though no one was ever looking for us. Her voice that night was soft but serious. "This house, it's yours, Lauren." I remember blinking up at her. "But it's Daddy's." She shook her head, smiled faintly. "No, it's ours. Yours. This place, it's where you belong." Then she kissed my forehead, and I believed her. That memory haunted me for years, because now standing in the same hallway at 27, I realized she was wrong. Or maybe I was. Because today my brother was about to take it from me. Ethan stood by the window, sunlight cutting sharp angles across his face. He held a folder, plain manila, too clean for something so heavy. "Dad wanted it simple," he said, not looking at me. I watched him from the doorway, still holding my bag like I didn't know whether I should drop it or run. "You've been living here rent-free since the funeral," he continued, flipping the folder open. He thought it was fair. "Fair?" My voice cracked before I meant it to. "I paid the utilities. I handled the maintenance. Ethan cut me off with a glance. "Cool. Businesslike. The same expression Dad used when denying me things I didn't dare ask for. "It's all accounted for," he said flatly. "It's just paperwork." He extended the folder like a favor. Inside were papers I didn't understand and didn't want to. I thought we'd decide together," I whispered. Ethan's lips twitched. Not a smile. A flicker of something colder. "We are." I stood there frozen, staring at the folder. For a long time I told myself it was trust that made me sign. But trust wasn't the reason. It was exhaustion. Exhaustion from fighting for scraps of warmth that no longer existed between us. Exhaustion from pretending this house still felt like home when every echo of my mother's voice had long been smothered beneath Dad's indifference and Ethan's silence. So I signed. I signed because I didn't know that signatures could steal you. I signed because my mother's ghost wasn't there to warn me. When I pushed the folder back, Ethan nodded once. Not gratitude, not relief, just confirmation. "Good," he said. He turned away before I did. And as I stood there, ink still drying where my name used to mean something, I felt it, the shifting. That sense of something cracking beneath your feet, but you're too late to jump. The house smelled different that day. I can't explain why. Maybe dust, maybe varnish, maybe memory. But it wasn't home. Ethan didn't explain what I'd signed. I didn't ask. And that's on me, because no one can steal what you hand them willingly. But then again, no one told me the cost. My mother's voice came back to me in fragments as I stepped outside. "This house is yours." I looked back at the porch. "No, Mom, not anymore." I didn't know, standing there in the sunlight, that I'd just signed away the last thing tying me to her. I didn't know Ethan had been planning this since Dad's heart stopped. I didn't know I'd learn what betrayal really felt like. But I would. Soon. Because the thing about trusting people is that they teach you how wrong you were. I walked away from that house thinking it was over. But the truth, that was just the beginning. I just didn't see it yet. It happened on a Monday, a full month after I signed the papers. I remember the time, exactly 3:14 p.m., because I glanced at the clock when the door slammed open. Ethan never knocked. He just appeared like bad weather. I was in the upstairs hallway sorting old picture frames. My mother's smile stared back at me from behind cracked glass. Ethan stood at the end of the hall holding a document. Different folder this time. Black leather. Official. Final. "You've got 1 week," he said flatly. I blinked, still crouched on the floor, her photograph trembling slightly in my hands. What? Ethan's jaw tightened like saying it tasted wrong. To move out. The words didn't compute. I laughed. A short, brittle sound that broke in the middle. "What the hell are you talking about?" He stepped closer. Not rushed, not aggressive, just certain. "You signed, Lauren, it's done." I shook my head. "Signed what? That was a maintenance agreement, a holding transfer. You said—" "I said what I needed to." I heard that sentence twice, once in the moment, and again every day since. I stood heart racing. I own this house. Ethan pulled out the document like a magician revealing the final trick. "No, you don't." I reached for it. He pulled back. "Touch it and I'll file trespassing charges." His voice wasn't angry. That scared me more, because I knew then he'd planned this. Long before Dad died, long before he handed me that first folder, Ethan walked past me smooth like he was done playing teacher to a slow student. 1 week he repeated, already heading downstairs. Then the front door slammed. I didn't remember sitting down. I just remember the silence. And the shaking. The kind that doesn't come from cold, but from realizing you've been standing in the wrong story all along. I stayed like that for hours. Not crying. Not thinking. Just empty. When my body finally remembered how to move, I stumbled into my childhood bedroom. Same wallpaper. Same crooked dresser. Same bed frame I'd helped my mother paint white when I was 12. I packed. Not like people in movies do where everything is chaotic and screaming. I packed neatly. Deliberately. Because that's how shock works. First I took the photographs. My mother's first. Then the sketchbooks. Then the blue vase she'd bought in Prague, now chipped at the rim. I wrapped them in old t-shirts like bandages over wounds I couldn't name. I packed until my fingers cramped and my throat burned and there was nothing left to pretend was mine. I don't know how many times I looked at that front door hoping it would open. It didn't. I was alone. Truly alone. And that's when the memories attacked. Because grief isn't always about the person you lost. Sometimes it's about the version of yourself you lost with them. I remembered Christmas mornings, Ethan and I racing down the staircase, Mom's laugh echoing through the hall. I remembered helping her repaint the window frames, both of us smearing paint onto each other's noses like some sitcom cliche, but it wasn't fake. Not then. I remembered her voice whispering under the staircase. "This house is yours." And now the echo of Ethan's, "You've got 1 week." Memory is cruel, because it doesn't just remind you of what you had. It shows you how easily it disappeared. I walked the house that night, room by room, touching door frames like they might remember me. But they didn't. The walls felt colder. The floors creaked in the wrong places. Even the kitchen smelled sterile. It wasn't home anymore. It was a tomb I didn't know I'd built. I stopped in front of the old piano. My mother's. She used to play late at night when she couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake upstairs listening to the soft notes drift through the floorboards, pretending they were lullabies meant just for me. I pressed one key. A hollow sound. Dust where music used to live? I stood there, hand resting on the keys, and let the realization settle. Ethan didn't take the house from me. He took the promise. The one my mother made me. The one I believed. I left the piano lid open. I didn't bother closing it. What was the point? I spent the next few days packing the rest of my life into boxes that felt too small. Each item felt heavier. Not physically, emotionally. Because every object was a lie I'd told myself about permanence. On the third night, I found the quilt Mom had sewn from my childhood dresses. I sat on the floor clutching it, inhaling fabric that no longer smelled like her. And that's when it hit me. I wasn't losing a house. I was losing history. Ethan knew that. He counted on it. He knew taking walls and windows wasn't enough. He wanted to take the foundation, so that when I looked back, there'd be nothing to anchor me. No place to say I belonged here. I whispered the words before I could stop myself. Hóa ra trong mắt họ, tôi chỉ là người dưng sống nhờ. The truth settled in my bones. In Ethan's eyes, in Dad's, maybe even in Mom's, I was never the heir. I was just the guest who overstayed her welcome. And the moment I signed that paper, I proved them right. I zipped the final box shut with shaking fingers. The sound of the zipper felt like a verdict. Final. Unforgiving. I curled up in the corner of my childhood room, too exhausted to cry, too numb to fight. And for the first time, I let the silence answer the question I'd been too afraid to ask. What am I without this house? I didn't know. I wasn't sure I'd ever know. But what I did know, the one truth I could still cling to, Ethan had taken everything. And someday, somehow, I would make him regret it. The motel smelled like mold and boiled coffee. I sat on the thin mattress, knees tucked to my chest, staring at the cracked ceiling like it held answers. The room was small enough that silence felt suffocating. No mother's piano, no echo of childhood footsteps, no walls that remembered me. Just peeling wallpaper and the quiet hum of a refrigerator that barely worked. 1 week. That's all Ethan had given me. It had been 3 days since I walked away. 3 days since my entire life fit inside 6 cardboard boxes piled next to the motel dresser. I hadn't eaten. I hadn't slept. I just sat there frozen, trapped between betrayal and disbelief. And then the phone rang. I didn't recognize the number. I almost didn't answer. But something, maybe instinct, maybe desperation, made me swipe. Hello? There was a pause, a breath, and then, Lauren. I swallowed hard. Yes, this is Martha. For a second, I forgot how to breathe. Aunt Martha. My mother's sister. Someone I hadn't heard from in years. Her voice was older, raspier, but unmistakably hers. I sat up, muscles trembling. Martha, why are you? She cut me off softly. I heard about the house. My stomach twisted. News travels fast, huh? Not fast enough. I said nothing. She inhaled shakily, the kind of breath people take when they're about to tell a truth they've buried too long. Lauren, listen carefully. I gripped the phone tighter. That house. It wasn't your father's to give away. The words hit me like cold water. What? It wasn't his. It never was. Silence. Then my whisper, like the child I used to be, I don't understand. She sighed, but there was no impatience, only sorrow. Your mother inherited it from her grandmother, passed down on her side of the family. That property belonged to her, not your father, not Ethan, to her. I couldn't speak. I felt the walls of the motel closing in. Martha continued, softer now. When she died, your father kept that quiet. He said it was safer that way. Safer for who? My voice cracked. No answer. Only silence heavy enough to drown me. Why are you telling me this now? I whispered. Another pause. Because you deserve to know, before it's too late. I pressed my palm over my mouth, swallowing the sob clawing its way up my throat. Was there a will? I don't know. Maybe. Her hesitation told me she knew more than she was saying. Martha, if there's a will, if Mom left anything, I can't help you, she whispered. Not directly. But Lauren, not everything in that house belongs to your brother. The line clicked dead. She was gone. I sat there in the silence, the phone heavy in my shaking hands. Her words replayed over and over. It wasn't your father's to give away. I looked around the motel room. Cardboard boxes, folded blankets, a childhood in exile. And suddenly rage bloomed. Not the hot, reckless kind. The cold, deliberate kind. Because if Ethan had stolen something that was never his, if Dad had let him, then maybe Mom had left a piece of herself behind. And I was going to find it. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and walked out the door. The night air hit me like glass. Sharp, bitter, but sobering. I didn't drive. I didn't call a cab. I walked. Every step away from the motel felt like pulling stitches from my skin. Streetlights flickered as I passed. My boots scraped against cracked pavement. In the distance, I could see the outline of the trees, those same firs that once cradled the house like guardians. I walked toward them. Toward the house that was supposed to be mine. Or hers. It didn't matter anymore. I wasn't walking toward memories. I was walking toward truth. The moon was a pale scar overhead, casting long shadows across the empty streets. My breath curled in front of me, smoke against the cold. The house stood in the distance like a wound I wasn't ready to touch. But I would. I had to. I thought of Ethan, of the folder, of the signatures I never read, and I thought of Mom. Her voice soft under the staircase. This house is yours, Lauren. Maybe she wasn't wrong. Maybe she just left the map unfinished. I was going to finish it. I crossed the final street. The gate was still broken where Ethan had never bothered to fix it. I slipped through. Gravel crunched beneath my feet loud in the night. I stopped halfway up the driveway. From here, the house looked dead. All the windows dark. The porch sagging slightly. The shutters closed like eyelids. But I knew better. I knew it was alive. It was watching me. Waiting. Voiceover if the truth was buried? I'd be the one to dig it up. I stepped forward. Not a daughter. Not a sister. Not a guest. A reckoning. Because whatever secrets my mother left behind, I was ready to find them. The old gate creaked behind me. I didn't flinch. I wasn't here to be quiet. I was here to take back what was mine. The back of the house loomed ahead, darker than memory allowed. The side porch sagged lower now, the windows shuttered and empty. The back door was locked, of course. I'd expected that. But I wasn't after doors. I circled the house until I reached the edge of the crawl space. The cellar door, half sunken. Weathered gray, almost swallowed by creeping ivy, Ethan never bothered to tear down. I crouched low, fingers brushing the cold iron latch. For a moment, I hesitated. Breaking in felt too easy. But then again, they'd already stolen everything. Why should I ask permission? I slipped the latch free. The door groaned open. Rot and cold earth hit me at once. That smell of forgotten places. I pulled my coat tighter, steeled myself, and slipped inside. The crawl space closed behind me like a mouth. For a moment, the darkness was total. Then my phone light flicked on, casting pale beams against the stone walls. Everything felt smaller down here, tighter. My breath came short. I pushed forward. Each step stirred dust that rose in choking clouds. I moved carefully, avoiding low-hanging beams. The air pressed in heavy, the silence complete except for the faint crackle of wood overhead. I remembered this place. Barely. Mom never let me come down here. This isn't a space for children, she'd said once, locking the door tight. I'd believed her. Now I wondered what she'd been hiding. And from who? At the far end of the crawl space, my light hit the base of the old storm hatch. Years ago, Dad had bricked over it after a storm flooded the lower pantry. Said it wasn't safe anymore. He lied. Next to the bricked hatch wedged between rusted shelves stood a door I didn't recognize. Narrow, steel-banded, locked. I ran my hand over it, searching for weakness. Nothing. No keypad. No latch. No visible keyhole. Only a handle worn smooth. I pressed. The door didn't budge, but the wood beneath the handle was warm. I frowned. That wasn't possible. Then I saw it. At the base of the door, just above the threshold, a faint strip of light leaked outward. Not bright, just a thin, steady glow. Someone had been here. Recently. My pulse spiked. I crouched lower, ran my fingertips along the frame. Then muscle memory kicked in. When I was 7, Mom used to let me play with the antique panels in her study. She'd taught me about hidden locks, spring latches, pressure plates, weighted hinges. I closed my eyes. Felt! There. A small depression beneath the left hinge. I pressed. A soft click. The door hissed open half an inch. Enough. I forced the rest manually, metal scraping against stone. It opened into darkness. My phone light trembled. I stepped inside. This wasn't a cellar. It was a room. Long, narrow, and wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. The walls were stone, but smoother than they should be, like someone had sanded them down. The air was colder here. Not just from earth or moisture, but from something deeper. Something older. I swept the light across the space. Dust hung heavy, but something shimmered against the far wall. I moved closer. Shelves. Old hand-built shelves. Most were empty. But on the third row, nestled between 2 cracked ledgers, sat a small tin box. Blue. I recognized it immediately. Mom's recipe box. I'd seen it 100 times in the kitchen. Why was it down here? I reached out, hesitated, then took it. It was heavier than it looked. Locked. I shoved it into my coat pocket. Something shifted behind me. I spun light slicing through the shadows. Nothing. But I wasn't alone. I felt it. The walls were too tight. The air too still. I forced myself to breathe. Focus. There had to be more. Mom wouldn't have hidden just a box. I scanned the rest of the shelves, brushing away dust-broken glass fragments of paper. No. Parchment. Old. Faded. I pulled one scrap free. Words written in her hand. To whoever finds this, I hope it's you. I almost dropped the light. Her voice filled my skull louder than memory allowed. I stuffed the scrap into my pocket. Something else caught my eye, a small leather-bound book. I grabbed it, flipping through brittle pages. Ledger entries. Dates. Amounts. Payments. None of it made sense. Until I saw one word scrawled in red ink at the bottom of the last page. Inheritance. And a name. My mother's. My knees buckled. I sat hard against the stone floor, the ledger clutched to my chest. For a moment the world tilted. Mom had been hiding something. Not from me. From him. From Ethan. From Dad. From everyone. A life she'd buried beneath our feet. And now I held it. Footsteps. Upstairs. Heavy. Measured. I froze. Ethan. I didn't know how. Didn't know why. But I knew. I had minutes. Less. I stuffed the ledger and parchment into my coat. Snapped off my light. The room swallowed me. The footsteps creaked above. Closer. I felt the vibrations through the stone. I pressed myself flat against the wall. My heartbeat was so loud I thought it might give me away. Every breath felt like betrayal. Then, silence. The footsteps stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the door at the top of the stairs creaked shut. I waited. Counted. 60 seconds. 90. Then I ran. Fumbling back through the narrow room, scraping my shoulder against stone, barely remembering to reset the hidden latch as I sealed the door behind me. Crawled through the passage, heart hammering. I burst out into the crawl space, tore open the hatch, and climbed into the night, gasping, shaking, but alive. Above me, the house stood silent once more. But I knew the truth. It wasn't silent. It was watching. I slipped back into the trees, clutching the tin box, the ledger, and the first proof that my mother had left me more than memories. She'd left me a trail. And now I was going to follow it. Dust poured out of the vent as I dragged the picture frame forward. I coughed into my sleeve, heart thundering, eyes stinging. My phone's flashlight flickered off old nails and splintered wood. The painting I'd grown up ignoring, a dull, oil-washed landscape of gray trees, now leaned crooked against the floor. Behind it, embedded into the wall, was what I'd been searching for. A safe. Old, rust-streaked at the hinges. No keypad, no electronic lock, just a combination dial. My mother's choice. She hated technology. If your hands fail, the machines win, she used to say, laughing as she stitched curtains in the kitchen. I used to think she meant nothing by it. Now I wasn't so sure. I stared at the dial. I didn't have the code. I sat down hard on this wooden floor, the silence of the old storage room pressing against me. I wanted to scream, but screaming wouldn't open a safe. Think. What numbers would she choose? A birthday? No. Too obvious. Something else. Something older. I closed my eyes. Memories filtered through. She used to hum in fours. She always cooked in threes. She painted window frames in pairs. 2, 4, 6. No. Then it hit me. The window above the stairwell. Painted red. Her favorite number. 7. She always said it was her circle number. Not luck. Balance. I spun the dial. Next. Her wedding date. April 19th. No. 1 digit too long. Just the month. I turned the dial to 4. Paused. And for the final turn, her favorite time. She always woke me at 6:15. Best light, she'd whisper. I spun the dial to 6. Then trembling, I pulled the handle. It resisted. Then clicked. And opened. My breath left me like a punch to the ribs. Inside dust thick as years. And 3 things. That was it. 3. A leather-bound notebook. A yellowed envelope. And an old battered cassette recorder. I reached for the envelope, first fingers shaking. On the front in handwriting I'd recognize anywhere for Lauren. I didn't open it. Not yet. I couldn't. Instead, I grabbed the notebook. A legal ledger. The pages inside were soft corners curling. Words scrawled in pen, no dates, no titles. Just lists, notes, fragments of thought. But at the very center, underlined in thick, angry ink, the house is for her. If you read this, it means I failed. I swallowed hard. Flipped further. Notes about my father, Ethan. Bank accounts. A clause I didn't understand. But always the same final line repeated like a prayer or a curse. Protect Lauren. The pages blurred as tears burned my eyes. I set the notebook aside. The envelope next. The glue had dried. It peeled apart easily. Inside, a letter. 1 page. Handwritten. Not by my mother, but my father. I stared at his name at the bottom. And I shook. Because in all the years he raised me, he'd never once written me anything. Never a birthday card. Never a note. Nothing. But this letter wasn't to me. It was to her. My mother. I read. And with every word my stomach hollowed further. He'd known the house wasn't his. He'd known she meant to leave it to me. And he'd buried it. Buried her. Buried the truth. The letter wasn't long. It wasn't even apologetic. It was a confession. I did what I thought was necessary. You were too soft. She'll never survive out there unless she learns how to lose. I folded the paper slowly. Carefully. I wasn't crying. I was past that. I felt empty. Then my shaking fingers reached for the last object. The cassette recorder. Heavy. Scratched. Ancient. I pressed play. For a moment, nothing. Then static. Then her voice. Soft. Tired. Real. Lauren, if you're hearing this, then you found what I couldn't say. I choked. She paused. A long silence, then. I tried to protect you. From him. From what I knew was coming. From the world that would eat you alive. A click. Like she was fiddling with the recorder. If you're hearing this, it means you've lost the house. My heart split. She knew. She'd always known. But that doesn't mean it wasn't yours. Remember that. Even when they tell you otherwise. I pressed the recorder closer as if I could crawl through the plastic into her voice. I'm sorry. 3 words. 3 syllables. But they cracked something inside me. I love you. Silence. Then static. Then nothing. I sat there kneeling on the splintered floorboards of that old hidden room, gripping that recorder like it was the only thing tethering me to the earth. Her voice. Her words. Proof. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I wasn't wrong. I was stolen from. I clutched the letter from my father in one hand, the notebook from my mother in the other. And I cried. Not loud. Not messy. Silent. Tears ran down my cheeks slow and steady. Because now I knew the truth. And nothing would ever be the same again. The tape clicked off. Silence swallowed the room. But it wasn't the silence that froze me. It was the sound beneath it. A door. Upstairs. Opening. Then closing. Heavy. Slow. Footsteps. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. I sat there frozen in the dark, her letter trembling in my hands, the echo of her voice still burning in my ears. Ethan was home. I heard the footsteps cross the hall above. Measured. Deliberate. I knew that walk. I'd heard it my entire life. Each step a lesson in control. I stuffed the notebook, the letter, the tape recorder into my bag. My fingers slipped twice. Hurry. Hurry. But it was too late. A voice sliced down the stairwell. Lauren. Not a question. A statement. I bolted. Shoved the safe shut. Swung the picture frame back into place. Dust choked me as I stumbled toward the cellar door. I didn't make it. He was faster. Ethan's shadow blocked the only exit before I even reached the stairs. He stood there at the bottom step, blocking the light like an eclipse. What are you doing? His voice wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. I backed away slowly. Get out of my way. His eyes flicked downward. Saw the bag. saw the corner of the notebook not fully hidden. His jaw tightened. What's in the bag? Move. Lauren, what did you take? His voice cracked then. Not fear, panic. I clutched the strap tighter. Nothing that belongs to you. He stepped forward. I stepped back. But there was nowhere left to run. He gestured toward this bag, voice low, shaking with fury. Give it to me. No. That single word shifted the air. Ethan lunged. I tried to spin, tried to dodge, but he was stronger. He grabbed the strap of the bag and yanked. I held on. Let go, I screamed. He pulled harder. I refused. Then the strap snapped. I stumbled back. Ethan staggered with the sudden weight, the bag now his. He tore it open. Pages spilled onto the floor. He froze. For a moment, everything stopped. His gaze locked on the letter, on my father's handwriting. He bent, picked it up, eyes darting across the lines. I watched color drain from his face. When he looked back up at me, something darker lived behind his eyes. You weren't supposed to find this. I stepped back. Why, my voice cracked. Why hide it? He didn't answer. Instead, Ethan dropped the letter to the ground and crushed it under his heel. I flinched. Don't you get it? His voice rose now, shaking the walls. None of this was meant for you. Not the house, not the money, nothing. I stared at him, breathless. His hands trembled. You were her weakness. I shook my head. She loved me. She ruined you, Ethan spat. Made you soft. Made you believe you deserved things you didn't earn. Tears blurred my vision. You're my brother, and I'm the heir. His voice was cold now. Final. I barely saw him move. 1 second he was standing. The next he slammed into me. I hit the wall hard. Pain ripped through my back. I slid down to the floor, gasping. The notebook, the tape recorder, everything scattered across the floor. I reached for them. Ethan kicked the recorder across the room. Stop. He grabbed the notebook. I scrambled up, coughing. Give it back. He stared down at me, holding Mom's ledger in one hand, like it was just another weight he planned to discard. Why, Lauren? His voice cracked. You're not strong enough to carry this. I don't need to be strong, I whispered, tears choking my throat. I just need to be right. For a second, for a flickering heartbeat, Ethan's mask cracked. But then the fury returned. He stepped closer. I backed away until my spine hit cold stone. He leaned down, eyes burning into mine. I'm the only heir, Lauren. His whisper was colder than any scream. This house, this legacy, it's mine. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. He straightened, turned, and walked away. Bag in hand, ledger clutched tight. He didn't look back. I sank to the floor, trembling, the air thick and sour with dust and defeat. Tears streamed down my cheeks. Silent, helpless. He was gone. And this time I knew he wouldn't make the mistake of letting me walk away again. Above me, footsteps faded. A door slammed. Then silence. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because as I sat there, knees scraped, heartbroken eyes burning, I realized something. He wasn't trying to win. Ethan was trying to erase me. And I wasn't going to let him. Not anymore. The bell above Miles' office door jingled once. I stepped inside and locked it behind me. He didn't look up right away. He sat hunched over yellowed papers, half-moon glasses sliding down the bridge of his nose, hands stained with ink that wouldn't wash out anymore. A man who'd spent decades digging graves and legal documents. He smelled like dust and old arguments, but he was the only person I could trust. And even that was a gamble. You shouldn't be here, Lauren. His voice scraped like sandpaper. I said nothing, just dropped the cracked notebook onto his desk. The sound made him flinch. He looked down at it, at my mother's handwriting, at the past. Then for the first time in years, Miles looked me in the eyes. Where did you get this? I pulled the chair across from him. Sat, let my silence answer. He exhaled slow and heavy. Then he opened the notebook. Page after page turned under his wrinkled hands. His eyes, dulled by time, sharpened as he read. And then his lips tightened. I saw it. Recognition, not surprise. Recognition. You knew. It wasn't a question. Miles closed the notebook gently, like he was handling a body. Your mother came to me 20 years ago. She wanted to redraw the deed, make it airtight, but your father refused to sign. Why? Because he knew the house wasn't his. I leaned forward, voice shaking. Tell me everything. Miles removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes, and started. The house wasn't in your father's name. Never was. Technically, it was your mother's property, inherited down her bloodline. But marriage complicates things. Your father assumed control after her death. Assumed. Miles nodded grimly. Legally, no, but practically, yes. No one contested it. Why? His gaze cut sharp. Because no one knew. I froze. He leaned forward, tone like iron. And Ethan, he's betting on that silence. I felt the world tilt. He forged it, didn't he? Miles didn't blink. Not directly. What does that mean? Miles reached for a battered folder from the drawer. He slid it toward me. Inside property transfer papers. Stamped. Signed. Filed. By Ethan. Dated 4 days after my father died. But Dad left the house to him in his will. Miles shook his head, tapping the folder. There was no verified will, not for the property. I stared down at the papers, and I saw it, buried in the text. The name on the original deed. My mother. Not my father. Not Ethan. My mother. Her handwriting. Her signature. Her legacy. I felt the betrayal twist deeper. Miles said nothing. He let me process. When I looked up, my voice was a whisper. Is this real? As real as the ink? I swallowed hard. And what Ethan filed? Fraud. The word dropped like a stone. Heavy. Final. I forced myself to breathe. Can I fight it? Miles's eyes held mine. You can bury him. The silence between us roared. I sat there shaking. Fury and grief and disbelief knotted inside me. And then, for the first time since my mother died, I felt something shift. Resolve. I want to take him to court. Miles nodded once. Slow. Then the smallest smile cracked the edges of his face. Good. He stood, reached for a fresh file. Then let's begin. And just like that, the war started. The living room of the old house felt smaller than I remembered. Smaller but colder. The walls that once echoed my mother's laughter now held something sharper. Something clinical. Every chair positioned, every table cleared, like the house itself had been prepped for a verdict. I stood in the center, the folder clutched tight in my shaking hands. The family arrived in shifts. Uncle James, first smelling of diesel and cheap cologne. He nodded politely like this was another funeral. Aunt Vivian pinched lips, eyes darting, already whispering to Cousin Elise before she even sat down. Then others. Some I barely remembered. And finally Martha. She crossed the threshold without hesitation. Her eyes locked onto mine. And in that moment I wasn't alone anymore. Ethan arrived last, as always. He didn't hurry. He didn't speak. He just moved straight to his father's old armchair and sat legs crossed, hands folded, wearing that expression he reserved for winning. Why are we here, Lauren? He said flatly. I looked around the room. Every gaze anchored to me. My throat tightened. This is about the house. Of course it is. Ethan smiled thinly, glancing at the others like we were inconveniencing him. Whatever accusations you're about to make, save them. You're embarrassing yourself. I took a step forward. Am I? I dropped the folder onto the coffee table. The sound cracked through the silence. Ethan's eyes flickered. What's that? Proof. He laughed once, short and sharp. Of what? I opened the folder. Inside, copies of my mother's deed. Her ledger. My father's letter. The recording transcript. Property records signed, not by Ethan, not by Dad, but by Mom. Her legacy in ink. I looked at them, then looked up at the room. At the time of her death, the house belonged solely to my mother. Murmurs rippled through the relatives. I continued, voice trembling but steady. She intended to leave it to me. She documented it. And my father buried that truth. I locked eyes with Ethan. And you forged the rest. His face tightened. Vivian gasped audibly. James leaned forward. That's impossible. Is it? I whispered. I turned. Martha. Every face swung to her. Martha stood slowly, hands trembling. But her voice didn't. I knew. Silence fell. She continued each word like a verdict. Your mother? She told me herself. Before she died. She never trusted Richard. She was afraid. Martha's voice cracked, but she kept going. She left the house to Lauren. She left instructions. But when she passed the papers, disappeared. And Richard told me he'd handle it. My hands trembled. The room wasn't breathing. And then Ethan stood. Suddenly, furious. That's a lie. His voice sliced through the silence. Martha flinched. Ethan stepped forward, eyes wild, pointing at me. She's lying. She hated Dad. She's always hated me. Martha shook her head, tears in her eyes. Ethan turned on the family. You're really going to believe this after all these years? Silence. Even Uncle James said nothing. Ethan laughed bitterly. I've held this house together. I've paid the taxes. I've kept the roof from collapsing. And now, what you're siding with her. He gestured at me like I was a stranger. Aunt Vivian whispered something. Elise looked down. Even his allies were slipping. Ethan's breathing grew uneven. Lauren's weak. Always has been. Mom spoiled her. Dad told me this house needed someone strong. He stared at me. You were never supposed to have it. I swallowed. Maybe not. I stepped forward. But it was never yours to steal. Something broke in his eyes then. Not rage. Not guilt. Fear. Pure primal fear. Because for the first time Ethan understood, he was losing. His grip on this house. On this family. On the story he'd rewritten for years. Ethan looked around the room, desperate now. No one met his gaze. He shook his head. Backed away. None of you understand. No one answered. He spun. Stormed toward the door. I watched him go, my heart cracking. Because the brother I thought I had, he didn't exist anymore. He hadn't for a long time. And as the front door slammed behind him, all that remained of Ethan was the echo of footsteps that never looked back. I stood in the silence, breathing, trembling, but not broken. Not anymore. I thought silence meant victory. It didn't. 3 days later, the first letter arrived, not from Ethan, from his lawyer. Formal, crisp, clinical. An official complaint filed in district court. He was suing me. Trespassing, theft, defamation. Violation of estate agreements. Ethan wasn't finished. He was fighting back. And this time he was fighting to destroy me. I stood in the middle of my motel room letter, trembling in my hand, reading the words over and over until they stopped meaning anything. Unlawful entry and removal of personal property. Intent to defraud rightful heir. Full transfer of all property per agreement. It wasn't just a lawsuit. It was a narrative. His version. I looked up. The walls felt smaller, colder, suffocating. I didn't even hear my phone buzz. Not until it rang twice. Unknown number. I answered. No voice. Just breathing. Then a click. Silence. I lowered the phone slowly. And that's when I understood. This wasn't a fight over property. This was war. Ethan was going to bury me. I sat down on the edge of the bed, knees pulled tight to my chest, the lawsuit papers scattered like broken glass around me. Each word felt heavier, more final. The charges weren't just accusations. They were a strategy. Ethan didn't care if he won. He just wanted me to lose, to exhaust me, to drain every cent I had, to make me wish I'd never fought back. The next morning, the press found me. Local news. Small-town gossip with cameras. A woman in a beige windbreaker cornered me outside Miles' office microphone, shoved toward my face like a dagger. Ms. Lauren, is it true you're contesting your brother's inheritance? I blinked against the sunlight. No words. No air. Did you break into the family home? Click. Flash. Are you being evicted? I turned away. Didn't answer. Didn't run. Just walked. One step at a time. Back toward the motel. Back toward nowhere. The headlines followed faster than I expected. Daughter or thief. Sibling war over historic estate. Heir under attack from estranged sister. I watched them scroll across my phone like cuts I couldn't stop bleeding. I stopped opening messages. Stopped answering calls. I didn't even check voicemail. Until the envelope arrived. No stamp. No sender. Slid under my motel door sometime after midnight. Inside a single typed note. Drop it or we'll make you. No name. No signature. Just those 7 words. I sat on the bed note in one hand, phone in the other, the threat coiled tight around my ribs. I wanted to cry, wanted to scream. But instead, I sat still. Hours passed. The sun rose. Light leaked between the thin curtains. And I sat in that silence, understanding the truth. Ethan wasn't just trying to erase me. He was willing to destroy me. Legally. Publicly. Personally. And what terrified me most wasn't losing the house. It was the realization that a part of him wanted me to lose everything, including myself. I lay back against the headboard, the motel's cheap wallpaper peeling behind me. I stared at the ceiling, dry-eyed, too hollow for grief. Because war isn't loud. It's quiet. It's the slow erosion of hope. And in that moment, in that dim, suffocating room, I felt every inch of it. Every crack. Every failure. And I asked myself, was I ready to keep fighting, or was I ready to let him win? The silence didn't answer. But somewhere deep inside me, something did. I wasn't done. Not yet. The courthouse smelled like varnish and fear. I sat stiff-backed at the plaintiff's table, the air too thin, the walls too close. Beside me, Miles shuffled papers, his knuckles bone-white, his silence saying what words couldn't. Across the aisle, Ethan watched me, arms crossed, lips tight, eyes dead. The courtroom door closed, locking us together. The clerk called the session open. Judge Henley entered, older, expressionless black robe trailing behind him like finality itself. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. Case 472C. Property dispute hearing Murchison versus Murchison. Hearing our names like that felt like a betrayal in itself. Judge Henley glanced from me to Ethan. Counsels. Ethan's lawyer stood first. Polished. Cold. He started with a lie. Your Honor. We stand today not due to a dispute, but due to deception. My client, Ethan Murchison, the rightful heir to the estate of Richard Murchison, is being targeted by his estranged sister, an individual who unlawfully entered the family property and manipulated prior documentation to undermine inheritance rights. I gripped the edge of the table until my fingers went numb. Manipulated prior documentation. The words burned, but it got worse. Furthermore, we will provide evidence indicating that Ms. Lauren Murchison coerced her late father into reconsidering estate documentation in her favor despite his declining health and impaired judgment. Miles shifted beside me. I froze. My breath caught. Coerced. They were claiming I'd forced Dad to change the deed. I wanted to stand, to scream. But Miles' quiet hand on my wrist said wait. Ethan's lawyer continued, voice slick as oil. In short, Your Honor, this case is not about rightful ownership. It's about a fraudulent attempt to rewrite history. He sat, and the silence in the courtroom felt absolute. The judge turned. Defense. Miles stood. No preamble. He simply slid a small envelope across the table. Your Honor, with permission, we'd like to submit an audio recording. Judge Henley nodded. The clerk pressed play, and then her voice filled the courtroom. Lauren, if you're hearing this, then you found what I couldn't say. I dropped my gaze to the floor. Her voice cracked through the walls, through my ribs. I tried to protect you. From him. From what I knew was coming. The courtroom was still. Ethan didn't blink. Didn't move. The recording continued. If you're hearing this, it means you've lost the house. Her words fell like stones. But that doesn't mean it wasn't yours. Silence. Static. End of recording. Miles spoke, voice low but steady. That recording was made prior to her death, found with the handwritten ledger of Rebecca Murchison, the legal property holder. He turned to Ethan. To be clear, not Richard Murchison. Ethan's lawyer objected. His voice cracked. But it didn't matter. The judge waved him down. His gaze was locked on me now. Ms. Murchison. I stood, barely able to hold my weight. Did your father sign any revised property documents prior to his death? No, Your Honor. Did you forge or alter any inheritance documentation? No. Did you coerce your father? I looked at Ethan. I remembered the slap of his voice against my childhood, his absence disguised as fatherhood, his cold detachment as inheritance. And I said clearly, I was never close enough to coerce him. The judge nodded once. Then, court will review the submitted evidence. He paused. Request for injunction on property sale is granted. This case proceeds to formal investigation. I exhaled. Not relief, just air. Across the aisle, Ethan finally moved. His knuckles white, his jaw tight, but his eyes held fear, real helpless fear. Because for the first time, I had won. Not the case, not yet, but the moment. And that terrified him. I sat, hands trembling. Miles leaned in, voice like steel. This is only the beginning. I nodded, eyes never leaving Ethan's. Let him see. Let him know. I wasn't leaving. Not this time. Not until every lie bled dry. I wasn't afraid of the house anymore. Not that night. Not after everything. I knew Ethan kept the original will somewhere inside. The one document that could end this war in one clean strike. So I went back. Not as a sister. As a thief reclaiming what was stolen. The moon hung low silver and indifferent, casting fractured shadows across the porch as I slipped through the back. The air inside felt thicker than the walls. I moved silently, each floorboard groaning under my weight like a warning. The study. That's where he kept Dad's files. The cabinet I couldn't unlock years before. Tonight, I wouldn't ask. I reached the door. Fingers brushed the handle. Then, I knew you'd come. His voice wasn't loud, but it cracked straight down my spine. I turned slowly. Ethan stood at the end of the hallway. No smirk. No mask. Just rage. You can't stop, he said softly. Even when you're losing. I'm not the one who's scared. His eyes flared. You think this is about fear? He took a step forward. I stood my ground. I know what's in that cabinet, Ethan. Then you know why I'll never let you open it. I tightened my grip on the crowbar in my coat pocket. My hands shook, but not from weakness. From clarity. You already lost in court. That was a delay. His voice cracked. I saw it then. He wasn't furious at me. He was furious at himself. For Dad, the house was everything he whispered. And she wanted to give it to you. He said it like her name poisoned him. I took a step toward him. She wanted to protect me. She wanted to erase me. His scream shattered the silence. His fists clenched. I spent years fixing what she broke. You mean what you ruined? Don't pretend you understand. His voice dropped to a growl. I don't want to lose everything to the one person who looks exactly like her. The hallway collapsed into silence. His admission hung in the air like gunpowder. You see her when you look at me. I see weakness. I see fear. I stared at him, eyes steady. I see a brother who can't let go. He moved first. Fast! His shoulder slammed into me, pinning me to the wall. The crowbar clattered to the floor. His hand closed around my throat. Tight. Unforgiving. I gasped. Fingers clawing. He didn't speak. Didn't scream. He just pressed harder. Tears stung my eyes. My lungs burned. I saw black spots bloom at the edge of vision. But I kept looking at him. Right into his eyes. And that's what stopped him. Not my struggle. Not my fear. My gaze. Unbroken. Unforgiving. He flinched. His grip loosened. I shoved him backward with what little strength I had. He stumbled. I collapsed to my knees, choking air tearing into my throat. Ethan stood there shaking, staring at his hands like he didn't recognize them. I didn't. I forced myself upright. You did. I grabbed the crowbar, and I ran. Through the study door, past shattered frames, straight to the cabinet. I jammed the crowbar between the latch, wrenched. Metal screamed. The lock shattered. The drawer slid open, and there it was. The envelope. Dad's seal. Untouched. I ripped it free, clutching it like oxygen. Behind me, Ethan didn't follow. He just watched. Silent. Defeated. I backed away. I'm ending this." He didn't reply. Not a threat, not a word. Just silence. And for the first time, that terrified me. Because silence was surrender. And Ethan didn't surrender. I fled into the night, the envelope burning in my hand. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Because I already knew that wasn't the last time I'd face him. But it was the first time he'd seen me win. The courtroom was silent. Not heavy, not tense. Empty. Like a house after a storm. I sat at the plaintiff's table, hands clasped so tightly my knuckles burned. Miles sat beside me, motionless, papers neat and untouched. But we weren't looking at them. We were watching the judge. And Ethan, he stood across the aisle, alone, his lawyer long silent. The final hearing hadn't lasted long. It didn't need to. The sealed envelope, the original, will lay open on the judge's bench. Unmistakable. Irrefutable. Signed. Stamped. Filed by my mother. Her handwriting, her signature, her final defense. Ethan didn't argue anymore. He hadn't said a word in the last 20 minutes. Not after the judge read the document aloud. Not after the photos of the broken safe were entered as evidence. Not after the tape recorder's playback echoed once more through the chambers. The tape I'd recovered. Mom's voice. Her truth. The only weapon that mattered. The judge adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke. Effective immediately, all property, real and financial, associated with the Murkison estate is awarded to Ms. Lauren Murkison as per the original testament and property deed. My heart stopped. Not victory. Shock. His words continued, clinical as a scalpel. The defendant, Mr. Ethan Murkison, is ordered to vacate said property within 30 days and to pay compensatory damages in the amount of $427,000 for wrongful seizure, legal fraud, and property misappropriation. I heard it. I understood it. But my mind couldn't catch up. Not yet. The judge looked at me. A single nod. Then the gavel fell. Once. Clean. Final. It was over. My vision blurred, but not from tears. From disbelief. Beside me, Miles released a slow breath, a small smile twitching his lips. But he didn't speak. He knew. Nothing he could say would matter now. Not in this moment. I turned and looked at Ethan. He stood frozen. Not furious. Not broken. Empty. His shoulders slack. His mouth parted, but no words came. His eyes locked onto the judge. Onto me. Onto nothing. I had never seen my brother look smaller. He tried to speak. Failed. He reached out once as if to steady himself, but there was nothing to hold on to. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Ethan didn't react. He just sank. His body dropped into the defendant's chair like something inside him gave out. And still he didn't look at me. I wanted him to. I wanted to see the boy I once followed through the woods, the boy who lifted me onto his shoulders, who promised to protect me from the dark. But that boy was gone. He had been gone for a long time. And all that remained was this hollow man drowning silently in the very emptiness he'd created. The clerk began gathering files. Chairs scraped. The audience shifted. Court was dismissed. But I sat still. I watched Ethan. Because I wanted to remember, not his defeat. But the moment he realized what he'd done, to me, to himself, to all of us, he never moved. Not as people filed past him. Not as the judge left the room. Not even as his own lawyer gathered his papers and stepped away. He sat there, alone, lost. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel victory. I felt pity. I stood, turned toward the exit, and left him behind. Not because I wanted to, but because there was nothing left to save. I stepped into the sunlight outside the courthouse. The wind was cold, the air sharp, and for the first time in years, I could breathe. The house didn't feel like home, not when the keys rested cold in my palm, not when the locks yielded under my own hand, but the walls still whispered someone else's story. I stepped inside. The silence met me first. Not emptiness. Not peace. Just silence, the kind that lingers after grief. The hallway stretched out in front of me longer now, colder. The floorboards still creaked in the same places, but I wasn't a child counting the steps anymore. I wasn't anyone's daughter. And this house wasn't my inheritance. It was my battlefield. I walked. Slow. Deliberate. Each step echoed. I passed the living room where Mom's piano used to sit. Bare now. Dust hung where music once lived. I passed the staircase where Ethan pushed past me for years, where we used to race in the mornings before words like ownership or inheritance meant anything, before survival replaced family. Every shadow in this place remembered who we were. I stopped in the dining room, ran my fingers along the scratched wood of the table, the place where Ethan sat convincing me to sign, the place where my father read wills instead of bedtime stories. I dropped the keys there, not as surrender, as closure. I wasn't keeping the house. I'd decided days before the verdict, before the courtroom fell silent, before Ethan collapsed into nothing. Because this place wasn't a victory, it was a wound. And wounds don't become trophies. I walked upstairs one last time, each step heavier than the last. My bedroom was still there, stripped bare, but the walls remembered me. I could feel it. But I wouldn't stay. Not anymore. In the center of the empty room, I placed the letter. Mom's letter. Her words written for a daughter she knew would be left alone. I didn't read it again. I didn't need to. Instead, I left it, right there, on the floor, for the house to keep, for memory, for closure. At the top of the staircase, I paused, looked back. Not in longing, not in pain, in clarity. Voiceover in my mind, words sharp but steady. I didn't fight to own this house. I fought to end it. I turned, walked down the stairs. Every step away felt lighter. I crossed the threshold one final time, pulled the door shut behind me, and stepped into sunlight, not as the owner of a house, not as a sister, not as a daughter, just as me, Lauren. Whole. Finally, the house stood behind me, silent, watching, waiting for its next chapter. But that chapter wouldn't include me. I walked forward and didn't look back. Not even once. The city wasn't loud, not in the way I expected. It breathed. Concrete and glass traffic and footsteps, morning coffees and strangers who didn't care where I came from. And that was what I needed, a place that didn't ask for my history. I rented a small apartment on the 7th floor of a building older than it looked. White walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, a cracked tile in the kitchen I didn't bother to fix. It felt honest. Most days I woke before the sun. The office was just 3 blocks down a minimalist studio filled with blueprints and quiet people who knew the language of design better than conversation. I liked that. They didn't ask about Ethan, or the house, or the trial. I wasn't the girl who sued her brother here. I was Lauren, just Lauren. And for the first time in my life, that was enough. I sketched buildings now. Simple lines, solid foundations. Not homes, not anymore. Structures. Because I'd learned something: you don't build for permanence. You build for function. You build knowing one day it will end. And that's okay. Some days were harder than others. Grief doesn't clock out. But it got quieter. And in that quiet, I found myself. One morning, after finishing designs for a riverfront renovation, I stopped by the nursery on the edge of town. Rows of green. The smell of earth and rainwater. I wandered, hands brushing leaves like memories I wasn't afraid of anymore. Then I found it. A small fig tree. No taller than my hip. I bought it without thinking. Carried it home in the backseat of my car, soil spilling onto blueprints. On my apartment balcony, small, cracked, nothing special, I placed the pot in the corner. I dug my fingers into the dirt, planting it steady. Watered it gently. And for the first time in months, I breathed without feeling like I owed someone an explanation. I sat there for a long time, watching the sunrise filter through new leaves. And I thought of her. Of the way Mom used to hum while planting herbs along the kitchen window. Of the way she smiled at me, dirt under her nails, life growing between her fingers. Her house was gone, her legacy rewritten, but her roots, they were here, with me. I rested my palm against the pot. Soft voice, steady now. Sometimes, forgiveness isn't for them. It's the only gift we can give ourselves. The city moved around me. The world didn't stop. But neither did I. Because this time, I wasn't rebuilding a house. I was rebuilding me, and I was going to be enough. The package was small. Brown paper. No return address. But I knew. Before I even opened it, I knew. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my apartment, the noise of the city filtering faintly through the windows, and unwrapped it slowly. Inside, a single object. A worn, leather-bound savings ledger. Old. Too old to matter. At least that's what I thought, until I opened it, and saw my name. Not scrawled hastily, not added after the fact, but written carefully in my mother's handwriting across the first page. For Lauren. A receipt tucked into the front. Deposits. Years of them. Small, steady amounts. From before she died. The last one made just weeks before. I didn't understand. I didn't want to. Because understanding would break me. A slip of paper fell from between the pages. I caught it. A letter. Not long. Not formal. Just a note in familiar loops and careful punctuation. If anything happens, ask Martha. I folded it gently, but my hands shook. And that's when the knock came at the door. Soft, but steady. I stood slowly, unsure how long I'd been sitting there. When I opened it, Martha stood in the hallway. Her eyes were tired, but her voice was steady. I thought you'd need me. She stepped inside without waiting. I didn't speak. She looked down at the ledger in my hands, nodded once. I was supposed to give that to you after the trial. My throat closed. Why didn't you? Because part of me hoped you wouldn't need it. Silence. Martha sat across from me on the floor, knees stiff, hands folded. She looked smaller than I remembered. And older. You mother started saving the day your father took control of the accounts, she said softly. She couldn't protect the house, but she could protect you. I blinked hard. She continued. She was scared, Lauren. Not of losing money, not even the house. Of losing you. Her voice cracked. Your father changed after Ethan was born. Your mother, she knew Ethan took after him. Too much. Same temper, same hunger. I clenched the ledger tighter. She planned for it, from the start. Martha nodded. She saved what she could. Quietly. Carefully. That was her real inheritance to you. A way out. In case. In case what? Martha met my eyes. In case this happened. The tears came suddenly. Hot. Brutal. Not the broken sobs of betrayal, but the quieter kind. The kind that comes from understanding the shape of someone's love too late. I curled forward, clutching the ledger to my chest, my body shaking. Martha didn't touch me. She just let me cry. Because some grief isn't meant to be interrupted. When I finally found air again, I whispered, voice raw, "She always knew." Martha nodded. She always knew. I looked at the ledger, at every number, every deposit, every act of quiet, deliberate love, and I realized the house was never the legacy. This was. She hadn't saved for my survival. She'd saved to buy me freedom. I wiped my face. Breathed. I wish she'd told me. She did, Martha said softly. You just weren't ready to hear it. I looked up. At her. At the woman who once held me when Mom was too tired. At the woman who stood behind me when the rest of the family didn't. At family. Real family. And I understood. I wasn't alone. I never had been. Not really. I exhaled, voice shaking but sure. I'll be okay? Martha smiled, small and sad. I know. And for the first time, I believed it. Because sometimes inheritance isn't land. It's love. Buried. Protected. Passed down in silence. And found exactly when you need it most. I held the ledger. And I let her memory hold me. Finally, the sand was colder than I remembered. Grain slipped between my fingers as I walked, the weight of the ocean pressing at my side like a patient, endless companion. Waves rolled in steady as breath. I watched the tide crawl toward me, then pull back. Again and again. The world kept moving even when I didn't. I carried nothing. No bags. No boxes. Just the small clay pot in my hands. It wasn't heavy, but I held it carefully as if it might break. The sun dipped low against the horizon, painting the sky in burnished gold and bleeding amber, the last warmth of the day slipping away. I kept walking, each step softer than the last. I stopped where the wet sand began, where the ocean kissed the earth without asking permission. And I knelt. For a moment I just listened. The sound of waves, the whisper of salt air, the silence of peace. Then without ceremony I tilted the pot and let the sand fall. Tiny particles. Slow, measured. The sand poured out in a soft cascade, scattering across the shoreline like memories too old to carry. I emptied it all, every grain, until the pot was light. Empty. I placed it down beside me, and I watched the waves take what I'd given. Voiceover quiet and steady. Legacy isn't a house. It's not money. It's not what they leave behind. It's who you choose to become. The ocean answered, stretching infinite. I stood, left the empty pot where it rested. I didn't need it anymore. I turned toward the horizon, and I walked. Not back. Forward. No destination. Just movement. Just freedom. The camera pulled back slowly. The beach widened. Sky swallowed the frame. And I, small, distant, just a figure wrapped in fading light, kept walking. Voiceover final, soft but unshakable. I am my own inheritance. Music rose, gentle strings, steady a melody without urgency. The sun dipped lower. Waves erased my footprints, and the screen faded to black. End.